Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something that literally sounds like it was ripped straight out of a sci-fi novel, a microchip inside your own hand. While it might sound like science fiction, it's actually a very real, highly regulated part of our modern financial ecosystem known as payment implants. We're going to take a journey through the objective, global legal frameworks that allow these microchips to exist, and then contrast that reality with the deeply subjective, very real fears that people have about this tech becoming the new normal.
Here is what we're going to cover today. We'll start with what payment implants actually are. Check out Europe's strong legal clarity on the matter, compare that to US microchipping laws, look at global availability and caveats, and finally, unpack the fear of coercion.
All right, Section 1. What are payment implants? The basics of under-the-skin payment tech.
So what are we actually talking about here? At their core, these implant payment systems use NFC or RFID technology. To put that in plain English, these tiny microchips, which are usually placed just under the skin in your hand, use the exact same radio tech as the tap-to-pay feature on your smartphone. They just link directly to a prepaid digital wallet. And legally speaking, when you're using them purely for voluntary payments, they're just considered passive consumer technologies, not medical devices.
Now, if you're actually looking to get one of these commercial, dedicated payment implants from brands like WalletMore or NXPay, they are definitely most practical in Europe right now. It's not because the chips magically stop working if you cross an ocean. It's simply because the specific e-money regulations and account eligibility requirements needed to make them work smoothly are heavily concentrated in the European market.
Moving right along to Section 2, Europe's strong legal clarity, the center of the commercial implant ecosystem.
Let's look at why Europe is really leading the charge here. Basically, voluntary implantation is totally legal across the European Union and the European Economic Area. But listen, it is definitely not the Wild West. It's incredibly highly regulated. First off, the implants absolutely must use biocompatible materials and meet some really strict safety standards. Plus, any personal data processed by these chips falls straight under GDPR, which, as you know, are some of the toughest data privacy laws on the planet. And looking forward, radio equipment rules are adding even more robust privacy and security requirements. So, if you choose to get chipped in Europe, the law is heavily protecting your privacy.
And when we talk about Europe, Sweden is the absolute standout globally for cultural acceptance. We aren't just talking about a handful of eccentric tech bros here. There are literally thousands of everyday users in Sweden relying on these tiny chips for everything, getting into their office buildings, scanning their transit tickets, and buying their morning coffee. It has become incredibly normalized there compared to literally anywhere else in the world.
Section 3, United States Microchipping Laws. Federal allowance versus state-level restrictions.
Now, crossing over to the US presents this fascinating contrast. At the federal level, getting an implant voluntarily is 100% legal. Actually, the FDA has historically approved certain human microchips, mostly for things like accessing medical records. But when you look at the state level, the narrative completely flips. At least 13 to 14 states have proactively passed laws specifically banning mandatory or coerced microchipping, especially by employers. So you've got the federal government saying, hey, you can choose to do this, while the states are stepping in to say, absolutely no one can force you to do this.
These state laws are essentially building a protective legal wall for citizens, and it directly impacts your everyday workplace rights. Take a look at these examples. Nevada mandates stricter laws on permanent identification markers. California just straight up explicitly bans coerced microchipping. Missouri specifically targets employers, making sure they can't mandate an implant just for you to keep your job. And North Dakota broadly protects against forced implants. The big takeaway here is the uncompromising protection of bodily autonomy. Nobody is stopping you from buying a chip voluntarily, but they are heavily protecting you against anyone demanding that you get one.
Okay, Section 4. Global availability and caveats. Global rules and personal responsibilities.
Here is a massive point to keep in mind. There is absolutely no global ban list for the voluntary adult use of passive, biocompatible payment chips. None. If you're an adult and you want one, most developed countries just file it under general rules for body modification and consumer products. The restrictions that do exist globally are almost exclusively focused on preventing mandatory implants, not stopping people who want them. But, and you knew there was a but coming, if you take the plunge, you were taking on a ton of personal responsibility. First, you've got to confirm your residency and make sure you're even eligible for the specific prepaid accounts these chips require. Then, the actual implantation procedure, that's on you to do safely. You've got to adhere to local hygiene standards and ideally use a professional body modification clinic. Finally, you have to accept all the individual responsibility for your privacy, your security, and the absolute headache of future-proofing. Tech ages fast, guys, and upgrading an implant in your hand isn't exactly as simple as trading in your old iPhone.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the fear of coercion, public anxiety and subjective concerns. When we step away from the sterile, boring legal jargon of EU directives and FDA approvals, we find some pure, unfiltered dread. For a lot of people, especially those with deeply held Christian or other religious beliefs, this technology touches a very raw, highly spiritual nerve. Many look at these chips and feel a profound, visceral terror about digital tracking, bodily autonomy, and apocalyptic end-time scenarios. The source material includes these passionate handwritten notes that perfectly capture this raw public sentiment. It really highlights how genuinely terrifying the normalization of these implants is to a massive chunk of the population.
Let's actually read a direct quote from these notes. How long will the EU governments only keep the biopayment microchip system just voluntary? This question right here. This is the absolute core of the public's existential dread. It's the ultimate slippery slope argument. The fear isn't necessarily about what the gadget does today, it's the paralyzing fear that a technology explicitly designed to be voluntary right now could slowly, quietly become a mandatory requirement just to buy food or participate in society tomorrow.
Breaking down the rest of the concerns in this note, we see a much broader, almost apocalyptic narrative of fear. The author doesn't just see this as a convenient tool, they view the cultural shift in Sweden as the biggest biohack, and they describe it as flat-out, very scary. There is genuine, deep-seated anxiety over the fact that all EU states legally allow it. And to top it off, the note ties these implants to wider systemic fears, things like a push for all digital currencies, digital IDs, and open borders. Now, our role here isn't to validate or debunk these specific claims, but we have to clearly illustrate that these subjective fears, this deep dread of an inescapable digital net, are a major, undeniable part of the cultural conversation.
Which leaves us with this final, critical question to ponder today. As digital infrastructure continues to expand all over the globe, how do we possibly balance the friction-free convenience of voluntary biopayments with this growing, visceral public fear of future privacy loss and coercion? The technology totally works, and the laws currently protect our choice. But as the gap between biological humanity and digital commerce closes, the debate over where to draw the line, it's really only just beginning. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. See you next time.